Picking up next, I'd like for us to move a little further south and across the ocean and look at Haiti. At the time of the Haitian Revolution, it wasn't actually called Haiti. The whole island was known as Saint-Domingue if you were French, or Santo Domingo if you were Spanish. Hispaniola was sort of the generic term for the whole island. The island is divided in half, and on the far western side is what is now Haiti, and on the far eastern side is what is now the Dominican Republic. The Haitian side, or Saint-Domingue as the French referred to it, was divided from the Spanish side by a large mountain chain. The predominant use of this island by the colonial powers, was of course for sugar only. And in fact, sugar was the predominant cash crop on most of the Caribbean islands. The problem, as we have addressed with sugar plantation growth, is that sugar plantations typically work their workers to death. We've discussed how slaves coming to North America might reasonably expect to live out their whole life, but slaves coming to a southern sugar colony, rather, would be dead within about 4 to 5 years. The challenges that are created in Saint-Domingue society are rather interesting. The first of which has to do with the slaves themselves. Certainly the slaves are going to try to resist their enslavement, and if they don't die in the process of being enslaved, they will often try to make an escape. The only place for them to really escape to, however, are these mountains that divide the Saint-Domingue side from Santo Domingo. And so what they end up doing is migrating into the mountains and forming maroon colonies up there, maroon from the term marooned, to be left behind. These colonies are often made up of slaves whose origins come from very diverse parts of Africa, and so therefore they don't speak a similar language. So one thing they have to do is actually create a language that they can all use, and so pidgin languages develop. This is not pigeon like the bird, but pidgin, P-I-D-G-I-N. These are mixed tongues that sort of mash up multiple different languages in an attempt to make something comprehensible out of something incomprehensible. If you escape and you make it to the maroon colonies, you tend to be left unmolested because the whites who would go after you have two real reasons for not doing it. The first, and probably more pragmatic reason, is that the mountains, of course, give the maroon slaves the high ground from any sort of attacking white person or white people trying to recapture them. And the reality is it was just simpler to import slaves from Africa rather than to waste time and resources and money going after the slaves that do manage to escape. The social structure in Haiti, or Saint-Domingue, is actually one giant mess, but very, very rigid as far as messes go. A French historian by the name of Paul Fergosi writes, quote, "Whites, mulattoes, and blacks loathe each other. The poor whites couldn't stand the rich whites. The rich whites despised the poor whites. The middle-class whites were jealous of the aristocratic whites, and the whites born in France looked down upon the locally born whites. Mulattoes," he wrote, "envied the whites and despised the blacks, and were despised by the whites and the blacks. Free Negroes brutalized those who were still slaves. Haitian-born blacks regarded the blacks born in Africa as savages." He writes, "Everyone quite rightly lived in terror of everyone else. Haiti was hell, but Haiti was rich." The four major groups are known as, at the top, the Grand Blanc, or great or large whites, large in terms of status, not necessarily size. These are the plantation and slave owners who tended, however, to live in France, not Haiti. They have grievances of their own. They are angry predominantly about trade laws and governmental attempts to improve the lives of the slaves, particularly as the French Revolution breaks out. They're, of course, going to find their own challenges with the French Revolution, mainly being that they are rich, and people who are rich tend not to come with their heads after long. The next group below them are known as the gens de couleur, or the free people of color. This is an interesting group of people, typically mulattoes and mixed-race peoples who serve in the militia. They could be wealthy on their own and even own slaves of their own. But they are legally discriminated against because both in Haitian society and still largely in French society, the expectation was that this was a society for whites. Below the gens de couleur, you have the petit blanc, or the small whites. These are artisans, laborers, poor whites, effectively, who are resentful not only of the Grand Blanc for their wealth, but also of the free people of color, who are, to their minds, racially inferior and yet somehow socially superior. Below all of that, you have the majority slaves. The Haitian Revolution, therefore, is largely a slave revolt that has the added bonus of having these internal political struggles being played out through the slave revolt. It's arguable how much the Enlightenment really does influence the Haitian Revolution. Certainly, Enlightenment writings and Enlightenment documents have their influence, but you're talking about a slave revolt and therefore a revolt of people who are largely illiterate. Therefore, any sort of influence they may have had is obviously going to be limited by that fact. The leadership, for example, Toussaint Louverture and a man named Belay actually do have some education, and in fact, most of the gens de couleur themselves will be educated and educated in the French system. Therefore, it's reasonable to believe that they had contact with Enlightenment ideals and Enlightenment documents. The beginnings of this revolt really go back to about 1789 with the writing of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. Between that document and a rumor that the king might have actually freed or the slaves, or at least ended slavery, a lot of these slaves gain hope and begin formulating a plan to actually have this rebellion. And the plan is actually rather simple. The plan is kill the whites, take the plantations, burn the sugar to the ground, and divide the land into small farms and give it to the slaves so that they may farm the land themselves. At the same time, the Petits Blancs, these sort of, poor white people, are not necessarily opposed to the idea of some sort of independence from France or something that would help them improve their economic situation, especially because of the oppression that they feel from the Grand Blanc. And the Petits Blancs will actually seize Port-au-Prince not long before the outbreak of the full revolution in the hopes of trying to set up some kind of democracy. And of course, those ideals do come, at least in some small part, from the Enlightenment itself. But things really get kicked off in 1791 when the slaves get fed up of everything and decide to revolt. The main result for most of the whites is that they simply leave. And we'll talk a little bit about where they go, but once the free whites leave, the slaves are able to take over. The problem is that the Spanish are sitting on the other side of those mountains watching everything that's going on with dread. Because, of course, if a slave revolt can be successful in overthrowing the colonial plantation system in Haiti, why not in what would eventually become the Dominican Republic right next door? The slaves are able to actually keep the Spanish at bay, and their leader, Toussaint Louverture, manages to take control and declare himself governor. He does a couple of rather interesting things, the first of which is he actually argues that Haiti should not become an independent country. Looking at what's happening in France with the Revolution, looking at the Enlightenment ideals that are coming out of it, looking at the idea that perhaps maybe France is going towards the way of abolishing slavery, Louverture argues that it's actually better if they remain a French colony. He also is very pragmatic and argues that the plantations should be kept intact and actually started up again. Not, of course, using slave labor, but rather allowing the former slaves to work the plantations for profit. Toussaint Louverture manages to become governor for about 8 years or so, and therefore never actually declares independence. Unfortunately for Louverture, things take a bit of a turn in Europe. By 1799, of course, Napoleon is now in charge of France, and by 1802, he decides he needs money. He's fighting these expensive wars of expansion, he's got a lot going on, and he decides that the best way to make that money is to recapture Saint-Domingue, Haiti, and turn it back into a sugar colony. So, with the force of French soldiers, he invades. The invasion, however, is thwarted by the reunited slaves, or former slaves, who manage to repel the French with the help of some pesky mosquitoes carrying malaria, but not, unfortunately, before Toussaint Louverture is himself captured. Louverture will die in a Parisian jail, but Napoleon is still no closer to regaining Haiti, and he still needs money. So what does he do? He turns to America. Napoleon was able to reacquire territory west of the Mississippi known as the Louisiana Purchase. After the 7 Years' War, this territory had actually been ceded mostly to Spain. But of course, when Napoleon conquers Spain during the Napoleonic Wars, he's able to sort of take some of what is theirs and use it. The original intention with that land was to actually start food-based agriculture in the area west of the Mississippi, grain, things like that, that would then send food down to Haiti to feed the people who were working on the sugar plantations. But of course, without recapturing Haiti, there's really no point, and so what does he do? He sells the Louisiana Purchase to Thomas Jefferson. Louverture's lieutenant, a man named Jean-Jacques Dessalines, now takes over, and it's actually Dessalines that renamed the island to Haiti, or Haiti, which is close to the native name for the island, and declares independence officially. Dessalines does not have Louverture's pragmatism and harbors, perhaps rightly so, significant resentment for the slave system. So it's Dessalines himself who actually orders the destruction of all of the sugar plantations, divides the land into small farms, and gives it to the Haitians to farm. In doing this, unfortunately, it is Dessalines himself who will condemn Haiti to becoming the poorest nation in the Western Hemisphere to this day. There is one rather interesting sidebar to all of this that goes back to those free whites who managed to escape. Many of them actually end up in the United States. Most of them end up in cities like New York, Charleston, New Orleans, Philadelphia, Savannah, Georgia, and Baltimore, Maryland. And in fact, Baltimore receives quite a significant share of these former French citizens. These citizens choose Baltimore largely because, of course, it's part of Maryland, which was at the time founded as a Catholic colony, or a haven for English Catholics who were escaping persecution. And so there's already a very comfortable Catholic population in Maryland. The problem, at least as far as most of the Americans are concerned, is that these expats will start to become in what are known as émigré politics. That's basically when expatriates, people from other countries, emigrate into a country, or emigrate from a country into another, and basically become involved in the local politics, typically trying to influence things in ways that would benefit themselves. The leadership becomes pretty frustrated with this, and coupled with the fact that there are people coming from France also trying to gum up support for American involvement in the French Revolution. The most famous of this is a man named Citizen Genet, who travels up and down the East Coast trying to drum up private support for the French Revolution. This doesn't sit well with the leadership, and particularly the Federalist leadership of John Adams. The Federalists themselves tend to be very interested in close commercial ties to the British, and so any involvement with the French or any support to the French Revolution or even the French in their reconquest of Haiti isn't going to go over very well. And so in the 1790s, during the height of the Haitian Revolution and the height of the French Revolution, with all of this foreign influence, Adams will pass the Alien and Sedition Acts, which both curb the amount of influence that any one particular immigrant can have by limiting, or by rather expanding the amount of time it takes to become a citizen, but then also making it a crime to speak out against the government, and that actually applies to citizens. So a very interesting sort of turn. The sidebar to all of this, however, is a woman named Elizabeth Patterson Bonaparte. Elizabeth Patterson was the daughter of the very wealthy shipping magnate William Patterson of Baltimore. William Patterson would actually end up lending his name to Patterson Park, and if you've seen the movie Hairspray, it takes place in Patterson Park. And he named his hometown in Baltimore Canton, after the Canton system in China, of which he played a very, very, in which he played a very, very big role as a shipping magnate. It's why the neighborhood in Baltimore is called Canton to this day. The Patterson family, being incredibly wealthy, derives their wealth partly from that mercantile investment, but is also, or Patterson himself is also the president of the Bank of Maryland, and therefore one of the wealthiest men in the United States. Simultaneous to all of this, Napoleon has several brothers, the youngest of whom is named Jérôme. Jérôme, in 1801, at the age of 17, is sent over to Haiti to try to get some military glory, and he actually does play quite a significant role in the 1802 capture of Port-au-Prince, and then was ordered to continue trying to find glory elsewhere in the West Indies. But he's 18 years old at this point, and for an 18-year-old Frenchman, finding glory typically just meant spending large amounts of money on women. In fact, Napoleon himself remarked on Jérôme's, quote, boundless extravagance and odious libertinism. Disobeying his brother, Jérôme made his way to the United States, Washington, in fact, where he met up with a friend, who then took him up to Baltimore, where he managed to make his way not only into the city of Baltimore, but into the heart of the young Elizabeth Patterson. Elizabeth, for herself, or for her own part, was actually considered to be one of the most beautiful women in the country. And the two of them fell madly in love. He was 18, she was 17. And as teenagers do, they tend to fall in love. And they got married on Christmas Eve, 1802, by Bishop John Carroll. Yes, of those Carrolls. Her dress, interestingly enough, seems to have created quite a stir. Jerome's personal secretary wrote, quote, "All the clothes worn by the bride might be put in my pocket," and another person spoke of the gown as, quote, "a mere suspicion of a dress." Napoleon was furious, in no small part because he had another brother, named Lucien, who had married a woman the day after she bore him a son. Napoleon worked feverishly to get this marriage annulled, and he even wrote to the Pope a letter that contained numerous falsehoods, or at the very least inaccuracies, but it was in vain. Lying to the Pope didn't really help, and by 1805, the marriage was still there, but sort of on the rocks at this point. It dissolved effectively in 1807 when Jerome ended up marrying a different woman, the daughter of the King of Württemberg. For her part, Elizabeth was granted a very handsome pension by the French government that lasted until about 1814. There were some particularly strict rules around this pension, and in fact, it all stemmed from a rather odd and embarrassing affair where Jerome thought he could bring his first wife, before he married the other one, his first wife up to Paris to maybe meet Napoleon. He thought, well, once Napoleon meets her, he won't be able to turn her down. Napoleon basically said she's not allowed to set foot on French soil. Jerome can come, but that woman has to stay on the boat. The French sort of repaid her with this pension, but she never really gave up her love for fashionable European society, nor did she give up her distaste for America. She deplored the fact that both her son and her grandsons, by the way, from Jerome Bonaparte, she deplored the fact that they both married American women whom she found as a group to be entirely beneath them. She wrote, "I have always told him that he should never degrade himself by marrying an American." She bemoaned her life in Maryland, stating, quote, "I hated and loathed a residence in Baltimore so much that when I thought I was to spend my life there, I tried to screw my courage up to the point of committing suicide. My cowardice, and only my cowardice, prevented my exchanging Baltimore for the grave." There are a number of very famous Bonapartes in America. Jerome Bonaparte, who married Elizabeth Patterson in 1803. Actually, their son, Joseph Bonaparte, the erstwhile Napoleonic King of Spain, actually lived in New Jersey from 1817 to 1832. Napoleon III himself actually spent a brief period of exile in New York in 1837, and Napoleon I, the original Napoleon, actually considered exile in America before the British sent him to St. Helena.